A woman named Rachel sent us a story about the day she walked into a courtroom and watched her own mother try to destroy her life in front of a judge. And what happened next is something we still can't believe. Rachel stood there silent, while her mother approached with a smile that promised victory, the kind of smile that said the game was already over before it even started. Her mother leaned in close, voice low and deadly calm, and whispered 6 words that would haunt anyone. "I'm taking everything you have." Around them, witnesses her mother had carefully selected painted Rachel as the villain, a cold, ungrateful daughter who abandoned her family and only returned to steal an inheritance. Rachel's lawyer looked terrified, fumbling through papers, barely able to make eye contact with the opposing counsel. And everyone in that room could feel it. This was a massacre, not a trial. Her mother had money-power connections and a story so perfectly constructed that even the judge seemed to believe it. Rachel appeared to have nothing, no defense, no allies, no way out. But then something shifted. Something no one saw coming. Not her mother, not the witnesses, not even the people who thought they knew Rachel best. Because while her mother was busy enjoying her courtroom performance, Rachel had been waiting not to defend herself, but to let her mother go far enough that there would be no coming back. This is her story, and here's what she told us happened that day. My name is Rachel Allen. I'm 36 years old, and until 6 months ago, I worked as a financial analyst for a mid-sized investment firm in Boston. I'd built a quiet, independent life for myself over the past 15 years, the kind of life where I answered to no one and made my own decisions. That independence is exactly what brought me to that courtroom. The hearing had been going on for 2 hours when the judge called for a 15-minute recess. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff from sitting in that hard wooden chair. And that's when my mother made her move. She walked straight toward me, past the low divider that separated the gallery from the tables where the lawyers sat. Her attorney didn't stop her. No one did. She came close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same one she'd worn for 20 years, and leaned in. "I'm taking everything you have," she whispered. Her voice was steady, almost gentle, like she was sharing a secret instead of a threat. There was no anger in it, no heat, just absolute certainty. She pulled back and looked at me with a small, satisfied smile, before returning to her seat beside her lawyer. I stayed standing there for a moment, watching her smooth her skirt, and settle back into her chair, as if nothing had happened. Around us, the courtroom was full of people who had no idea what they'd just witnessed. To them, it probably looked like a mother trying to reach out to her daughter. That's the thing about my mother. She's always known how to control what people see. When the hearing resumed, her attorney called the first witness, Dr. Harrison, a silver-haired psychiatrist with an expensive suit and a calm, authoritative voice, took the stand. He'd been my stepfather's doctor during the last year of his life, though I'd never met him before today. "In your professional opinion," my mother's lawyer asked, "what was Mr. Allen's mental state in the months before his death?" Dr. Harrison folded his hands. "He was under significant stress, memory lapses, confusion about dates and names, difficulty concentrating. Classic signs of cognitive decline in elderly patients." I watched the judge take notes. The doctor wasn't lying, not exactly. My stepfather had been 73 when he died, but what Dr. Harrison didn't mention was that those symptoms were mild, that my stepfather had been sharp enough to manage his business until 2 weeks before his death, that he'd met with his lawyer twice to ensure his will was exactly what he wanted. The accountant came next. Margaret Chen, who'd handled my stepfather's finances for a decade, testified that I'd had unusually increased contact with him in the months before he signed his will. She presented phone records, email logs, visit schedules. Everything looked damning on paper. What she didn't say was that my stepfather had reached out to me first, that he'd asked me to help him understand some investment statements because he didn't trust my mother with the details, that every single one of those visits had been at his request. Then came Mrs. Patterson, the neighbour who'd lived next door for 15 years. She was a small grandmotherly woman who looked uncomfortable on the witness stand, but spoke clearly when my mother's lawyer asked her questions. In all the years you lived next to the Allens, how often did you see Rachel visit? Mrs. Patterson shook her head. Almost never. I didn't see her once in the last 10 years until Mr. Allen got sick. Then suddenly she was there all the time. The implication hung in the air like smoke. I was the absent daughter, who only appeared when there was something to gain. My mother's lawyer didn't need to say it. Mrs. Patterson's sad, disappointed expression said it all. I glanced at my attorney, Richard Morrison. He was hunched over his legal pad, pen in hand, but he wasn't writing anything. His face was pale, and when my mother's lawyer finished with Mrs. Patterson, Richard stood up slowly. "No questions, Your Honor," he said. I'd hired Richard because I could barely afford him. After my mother had gotten the court to freeze the joint accounts my stepfather had set up, accounts she claimed I'd manipulated him into creating, I was left with only my own savings. Richard had taken my case for half his usual rate, and now I understood why. He was terrified. During the next break, I watched him shuffle papers at our table, his hands shaking slightly. When my mother's attorney walked past, Richard's eyes dropped to his notepad. He couldn't even look the man in the eye. "Maybe we should consider their settlement offer," Richard said quietly, leaning toward me. "Your mother's willing to give you $20,000 if you drop the contest to the will. It's not nothing, Rachel. And if we lose, you get nothing at all." I looked at him. Richard Morrison was a decent man, probably a good lawyer, when he wasn't drowning in a case he couldn't handle. But that's exactly why I'd kept him. My mother needed to believe I was desperate, outmatched, defeated. A confident, expensive attorney would have made her cautious. Richard made her certain. "No," I said simply. Throughout the rest of the afternoon, I sat perfectly still. I didn't object when the witnesses twisted the truth. I didn't react when my mother's lawyer painted me as a manipulative stranger who'd swooped in to steal a dying man's fortune. I didn't even flinch when he showed the judge a photograph of my stepfather's signature on the will and suggested it looked shaky, uncertain, possibly coerced. I just watched. I studied every witness who took the stand, noted every small exaggeration they made, catalogued every piece of context they conveniently forgot to mention. I watched my mother sitting at her table, straight-backed and composed occasionally, whispering to her attorney. I watched the judge's face, trying to read whether he believed what he was hearing. But mostly I watched my mother. Because every time a witness finished testifying, every time her lawyer scored a point, every time Richard fumbled an objection or suggested I settle, she would glance at me, just for a second. And each time her smile grew a little wider. She thought she was watching me break. She thought my silence was defeat, that my terrible lawyer was proof I had nothing left to fight with, that her carefully constructed story had already won. My mother smiled because she thought my terrible lawyer proved she'd already won, but she didn't know I needed her to believe exactly that. The courtroom was even more crowded on the second day. I arrived early and took my seat beside Richard, who looked like he'd barely slept. My mother sat across the aisle with her attorney, wearing a navy suit that made her look like the grieving widow she wanted everyone to see. When the judge entered, my mother's lawyer stood immediately. "Your Honor, we'd like to call our next witness, Thomas Bradley." I didn't recognize the name until a thin man in his 60s walked through the courtroom doors. He'd been my stepfather's business partner for 30 years, someone I'd met exactly twice at company dinners. "Mr. Bradley," my mother's attorney began, "how long did you know the deceased?" 3 decades. We built the company together from nothing. "And in all that time, how often did you see his stepdaughter, Rachel?" Bradley adjusted his glasses. "I met her once, maybe twice. She wasn't part of his life. He never talked about her, never mentioned her in all our conversations. Then about 8 months before he died, her name started coming up. He seemed confused about it, actually. Said she'd been calling him, asking about his finances, wanting to know about his assets." My hands stayed folded in my lap. What Bradley didn't say was that my stepfather had called him paranoid, that their friendship had been strained for years because Bradley wanted to push the company in directions my stepfather disagreed with. He didn't mention that my stepfather had started those conversations about me because he was proud, because he'd told Bradley I was helping him understand investment portfolios that Bradley himself had mismanaged. The next witness was a woman named Janet Reeves, who'd been my stepfather's housekeeper for 5 years. She testified that during his illness, my mother had been there every single day, managing his medications, coordinating with doctors, keeping the house running. She said she'd never seen me visit during those years of slow decline, only during the final 6 weeks. And when Rachel did start visiting, my mother's lawyer asked, "What did you observe?" Janet hesitated, glancing briefly at my mother. She was always asking Mr. Allen questions about his business, his accounts, his legal papers. He seemed tired after her visits. Mrs. Allen had to ask her several times not to exhaust him. I remembered those visits differently. My stepfather pulling me aside to show me documents he didn't trust my mother to handle honestly. Him asking me to witness his signature on papers because he wanted someone he trusted to know what he was signing. My mother standing in doorways watching her face tight with controlled anger every time he spoke to me. But Janet Reeves didn't mention any of that. She painted a picture of a devoted wife protecting her husband from an intrusive stepdaughter, and the judge wrote it all down. Then my mother's lawyer said something that made my stomach drop. "Your Honor, we have one more witness. Someone who can speak to the defendant's character and her true feelings about her mother. We call Sarah Mitchell." The courtroom doors opened and Sarah walked in. 20 years. We'd been friends for 20 years. She'd been at my college graduation, my wedding, my divorce. She'd helped me move into my first apartment and held me when my stepfather died. We'd had coffee 2 weeks before this hearing started, and she'd told me she was sorry about everything I was going through. Now she walked past me without making eye contact and took the witness stand. My mother's attorney handed her a folder. "Miss Mitchell, how long have you known the defendant?" "Since we were in college. About 20 years. Sarah's voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "And would you say you know her well?" "Yes, very well." "Have you ever discussed her relationship with her mother?" Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. "Many times. Rachel was very angry with her mother. She talked about it often." The attorney pulled out printed pages. "Do you recognize these emails?" Sarah nodded. "Rachel sent them to me about 10 years ago. Would you read the highlighted portion for the court?" Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "It says, 'I'm done with her. She'll never control me again. I don't care if I never see her face. As far as I'm concerned, I don't have a mother anymore.'" The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge banged his gavel once. I stared at Sarah and finally she looked at me. For just a second I saw something in her eyes, fear maybe, or guilt. Then she looked away. That email was real. I'd written it the day after my mother had called my ex-husband and told him lies that destroyed what was left of our marriage. I'd written it when I was furious and hurt, and finally ready to cut ties completely. But there had been 20 other emails in that thread explaining exactly why I'd written those words, showing what my mother had done, giving context that made me sound like a woman protecting herself instead of a hateful daughter. Sarah had given them the one email that made me look like a monster. "No further questions?" my mother's attorney said. Richard stood up. I could see his hands shaking. "Miss Mitchell, were there other emails in this exchange?" "Yes." "Did those emails provide context for this statement?" My mother's lawyer was already on his feet. "Objection. Relevance. The witness has provided the defendant's own words. Context doesn't change what was written." "Sustained," the judge said. Richard sat down. He didn't even try to fight it. Sarah left the stand and walked out of the courtroom, quickly, still not looking at me. I watched her go and wondered what my mother had offered her. Money, probably. Or maybe a threat. My mother had always been good at finding people's pressure points. Across the aisle, my mother's face showed the smallest hint of satisfaction. She thought she'd just delivered the killing blow. She thought that watching my best friend betray me in open court would break something inside me. I sat perfectly still and said nothing. My mother had bought the person I trusted most, but she hadn't realized that every betrayal was pushing her closer to the edge I'd been waiting for. On the third day, the judge delivered his temporary ruling. My mother would continue as administrator of the estate, but all assets would remain frozen until the final judgment. No property could be sold, no accounts could be touched, no transfers could be made without court approval. Richard didn't even try to appeal. He gathered his papers, mumbled something about how we'd regroup before the next hearing, and left the courtroom, looking relieved it was over for now. I nodded and walked out alone. My mother caught up with me in the hallway outside. She didn't say anything, just smiled and kept walking. That smile told me everything. She'd won the first battle and she expected the rest to be just as easy. I went home to my small apartment and spent the next 2 days going through every dollar I had left. After the joint accounts were frozen, I'd been living on my own savings. It wasn't much, but it was enough for what I needed to do next. I hired Marcus Chen, a private investigator, who'd worked fraud cases for 20 years, and Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a forensic document examiner, who'd testified in federal court. I paid them with the last of my savings and told them exactly what I needed: examine every document my mother had submitted to the court as evidence. I didn't tell Richard. He would have advised against it, worried about the cost, or worse, accidentally mentioned it to opposing counsel during some procedural discussion. This had to stay quiet. 2 weeks later, Marcus called me to his office. He spread a dozen documents across his desk, each one flagged with colored tabs. "Look at these authorization forms," he said, pointing to papers that supposedly gave my mother power of attorney over my stepfather's medical decisions. The signatures match authenticated samples, but the file metadata tells a different story. These digital files were created 5 days after your stepfather died. De Reynolds pulled up images on her laptop, signatures magnified until I could see every pen stroke. Notice the pressure patterns here and here. Your stepfather's authentic signatures from his final weeks show tremor-inconsistent pressure. These are too smooth, too perfect. They could be tracings or digital copies pasted from earlier documents. She showed me another file. This revised will that suddenly appeared, the one giving your mother full control, has similar issues. The paper is correct. The notary seal looks legitimate, but the signature itself doesn't match the natural variation we see in authentic samples from the same time period. I stared at the documents. "Is this enough to prove forgery?" Marcus shook his head. "Not definitively. A good lawyer could argue the files were rescanned for better quality, or that your stepfather's condition varied day to day. We'd need more. A pattern of behavior, multiple instances, something that can't be explained away." I made my decision right there. "Don't submit any of this yet." Dr. Reynolds looked surprised. "But this could help your case?" "One forged signature can be excused," I said. "I need to wait until there's no excuse left." I paid them to keep investigating and left with copies of everything they'd found. Then I went home and waited. My mother didn't disappoint. Within days, she started making moves. I received a letter from my stepfather's business attorney informing me that certain commercial properties were being prepared for sale to cover estate legal fees. Another letter came from the bank notifying me of account restructuring for better estate management. Each letter had official letterhead, notarized signatures, proper legal language. Then my former colleague at the investment firm called me. "Rachel, I don't know how to tell you this, but your mother contacted our managing director. She warned him that you were mentally unstable, that you were making fraudulent claims about your stepfather's estate, and that anyone who worked with you should be cautious." I thanked him for letting me know and hung up. 2 days later, Marcus sent me photographs. My mother had filed papers with the county recorder's office, transferring title on one of the properties into a trust she controlled. The signature on the transfer documents was supposedly mine. I'd never signed anything, I looked at the notary stamp, the date, the careful forgery of my own signature. It was good work, probably done by someone professional, but it was still fraud. Marcus called that evening. She's getting bolder. I've tracked 3 more documents in the past week, all with questionable signatures, all moving assets or authority around. She thinks her position as administrator gives her unlimited power. Let her think that, I said. Rachel, if we wait too long, we wait until the pattern is undeniable, until there's so much evidence that no judge can ignore it. I started keeping a folder, every letter, every notification, every document that came through with my mother's fingerprints on it. Marcus and Dr. Reynolds kept sending me their findings, signatures that didn't quite match, file timestamps that didn't make sense, notarizations that looked suspicious when cross-referenced with the notary's actual schedule. My mother was building a mountain of fraud, one document at a time, and she had no idea I was cataloging every piece of it. She called me once during those 2 weeks. Rachel, we could still settle this reasonably. I'm willing to give you $50,000 to walk away. After all the legal fees, that's probably more than you'll get if this goes to trial. I almost laughed. $50,000, when my stepfather's estate was worth millions. She really thought I was beaten. I'll see you in court, I said, and hung up. My mother was digging her own grave, every forged signature. Every unauthorized decision was a brick I was quietly stacking into a wall that would surround her. 4 weeks after the hearing started, we returned to court for what everyone assumed would be the final session. My mother arrived with her lawyer, both of them looking relaxed, almost cheerful. Richard sat beside me, his briefcase thin with barely any documents inside. The judge took his seat and looked directly at me. Ms. Allen, I've reviewed all the testimony and evidence presented. Before we proceed, I want to ask if you've reconsidered settlement. Your mother has made what I consider to be a fair offer under the circumstances. Fair, the word hung in the air like poison. My stepfather's entire estate in exchange for $75,000, less than what my mother had probably spent on her legal team. No, Your Honor, I said. I haven't reconsidered. My mother's lawyer stood confident and relaxed. Your Honor, the plaintiff has presented a clear pattern of behavior. The defendant abandoned her family, returned only when financial gain was possible, and manipulated a sick elderly man into changing his will. We believe the evidence speaks for itself. The judge nodded slowly, making notes. I could see which way this was heading. Everyone in that courtroom could. Richard looked at me with something like pity. He thought I was throwing away my last chance. I stood up. Your Honor, I'd like to request a 1-week postponement to gather additional documentation relevant to this case. The judge's expression tightened. Ms. Allen, this court has been more than patient. We've already granted 1 extension. I understand, Your Honor, but new information has come to my attention that requires proper documentation before presentation. My mother's lawyer was smiling now. Your Honor, this is clearly a stalling tactic. The defendant has had ample time to prepare her case. The judge sighed. Ms. Allen, this is your final extension, 1 week. When we reconvene, I expect this matter to be ready for final judgment. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. As I left the courtroom, I heard my mother's lawyer chuckle. Richard gathered his papers without looking at me. They all thought I was desperate, grasping at straws, buying time because I had nothing left. 2 days later, I was at home when my phone rang. It was Richard, his voice tight and strange. Rachel, I just received a notification from First National Bank. It's addressed to me as your attorney of record. Your mother transferred $240,000 from the estate account to her personal account yesterday. I sat down slowly. The estate account that's under court freeze order. Yes. The bank's compliance system flagged it automatically because of the court order. They've already notified the judge. I called Jennifer Hartwell that same afternoon. She was the kind of lawyer I should have hired from the beginning, expensive and sharp. I'd kept her number since the case started, waiting for the right moment. I paid her retainer with money I'd borrowed from my own retirement account and told her exactly what I needed. An emergency motion for contempt of court, she said immediately. Your mother violated a direct court order. We can get a hearing within 48 hours. She filed the motion that evening. 3 days after my mother made her move, we were back in court. The emergency hearing was nothing like the previous sessions. The judge's face was severe as he reviewed the bank's notification. My mother's lawyer stood and tried to explain. Your Honor, my client believed her position as temporary administrator gave her authority to manage estate funds for legitimate expenses. The court's order was explicit. The judge said, his voice cold. All assets frozen. No transfers without court approval. What part of that was unclear to your client? It was a misunderstanding of the scope of her authority. It was a direct violation. The judge turned to my mother. Mrs. Allen, you transferred a substantial sum from an account this court specifically ordered frozen. That is contempt. For the first time since this all started, my mother's face showed something other than confidence. She looked at her lawyer and then at the judge, and I saw the moment she realized she'd made a mistake. Jennifer stood. Your Honor, given this violation, we request a comprehensive forensic examination of all documents the plaintiff has submitted as evidence. She handed the clerk a folder. We have a preliminary report from a private investigator showing irregularities in file metadata and signature authentication. We believe the court should examine these materials independently. My mother's lawyer objected immediately. This is a baseless accusation meant to distract from the real issues in this case. But the judge was already reading the report. His expression grew darker with each page. I'm ordering a full forensic examination of all submitted documents, he said. The court will appoint an independent expert. We'll reconvene in 1 week. My mother's smile was gone. She stared at the judge, then at me, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes. My mother believed her power was big enough that no one would dare stop her, but she forgot there's something bigger than power, the law itself. 1 week later, the court-appointed forensic document examiner took the stand. Dr. William Foster had testified in federal fraud cases for 15 years, and he didn't waste time with preliminaries. I examined 23 documents submitted by the plaintiff, he said, projecting images onto a screen. These documents, allegedly dated 2023, bear notary seals that didn't exist until 2024. The seal design was introduced by the manufacturer in January of last year. It's physically impossible for these documents to have been notarized when they claim to have been. He pulled up another image. Ink analysis reveals similar problems. Several documents, supposedly signed in 2023, contain ink formulations that weren't commercially available until mid-2024. Additionally, 3 separate documents show signatures with identical pressure patterns and stroke angles. This is characteristic of photocopied signatures that were digitally pasted onto different documents. The courtroom was silent. My mother sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped on the table in front of her. Dr. Foster continued, in my professional opinion, these documents were created recently and backdated to appear legitimate. The judge called a brief recess, and when we returned, the notary was brought in. His name was Dennis Kowalski, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years since being subpoenaed. When confronted with Dr. Foster's findings, he broke. She knew about a mistake I made 5 years ago, he said quietly. A notarization I did without properly checking ID. It was stupid, but I was new and didn't know better. Mrs. Allen found out somehow and said she'd report me to the state board if I didn't help her. I'd lose my license, my livelihood. So I did what she asked. I backdated the notarizations, made them look legitimate. My mother's lawyer stood to object, but the judge waved him down. The damage was done. Everyone in that courtroom knew what they were hearing. 6 days later, we assembled for the final hearing. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the forgery evidence, and people were curious to see how it would end. My mother wore black, like she was already in mourning for what she was about to lose. The judge entered, and everyone stood. When he took his seat, he didn't waste time. "I've reviewed all evidence and testimony," he began. "First, regarding the validity of the will. The original will, executed by the deceased, is valid and enforceable. All claims challenging it are dismissed. The estate assets belong to Rachel Allen as specified in that document." My mother's face went pale, but the judge wasn't finished. "Second, regarding violations committed during these proceedings. Mrs. Allen seriously violated this court's freeze order by transferring $240,000 without authorization. Mrs. Allen submitted forged documents to this court as evidence. Mrs. Allen abused her authority as temporary administrator in multiple documented instances." He looked directly at my mother. "Third, civil penalties. Mrs. Allen will return the $240,000 transferred illegally plus 10% annual interest, totaling $24,000. For contempt of court, a fine of $75,000. For sanctions related to submitting fraudulent documents, $50,000. The total amount owed is $389,000 payable within 90 days. My mother's lawyer was frantically writing notes, but there was nothing he could do. The judge continued. "Fourth, I'm referring this matter to the State Bar for investigation of counsel's role in these proceedings. The notary will be referred to the district attorney for potential criminal prosecution. As for Mrs. Allen herself, given her age and the fact that this appears to be a first offense, I'm recommending against criminal charges provided full restitution is made." The gavel came down. It was over. In the days that followed, the consequences rippled outward. My mother's lawyer, facing a state bar investigation, chose to surrender his license voluntarily, rather than go through formal disbarment proceedings. It was reported in the legal newsletter, and I saw the notice myself. My mother's brother called me 2 weeks after the verdict. "I want you to know I had nothing to do with this," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Your mother transferred property into my name without telling me what she was doing. Now I'm caught up in her mess. I'm done with her." The friends who had testified for her, who had sat in the gallery, nodding along with her version of events, quietly disappeared from her life. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbour, stopped returning her calls. The women from her book club found reasons to meet elsewhere. In a community where reputation was everything, my mother had become toxic. 1 month later, the district attorney's office sent a formal letter declining to prosecute. My mother had made full restitution. She was 68 years old, and it was technically a first offense. But the letter didn't matter. She'd already lost everything that mattered to her. 2 weeks after the verdict became final, I ran into my mother in a grocery store parking lot. We were both walking to our cars when we saw each other. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she walked over. No lawyers, no courtroom, just the two of us in the afternoon sun. "You planned this from the beginning, didn't you?" she asked. "No," I said. "I just let you do what you always do, and I waited." Her face hardened. "You'll regret this." I looked at her, this woman who had tried to destroy me, who had bought my friend's betrayal, who had forged documents and lied to a court, all because she couldn't stand that I'd escaped her control 20 years ago. "No, Mum," I said quietly. "This time I don't need to apologize." I turned and walked to my car. I didn't look back. I didn't feel the rush of victory I'd imagined. I just felt tired and free. The relationship was gone, burned to ash in that courtroom. But that was the price. Some cages you can only escape by destroying them completely. I drove home to my apartment, to the quiet life I'd built without her, and I knew I'd never have to fight this battle again. Mum said she'd take everything from me, but the one thing she really wanted, control, she'll never have again. And that's all that matters. That's Rachel's story, and honestly, when she first sent it to us, I had to read it twice to believe it. Here's a woman who walked into a courtroom, completely alone, facing a mother who had money, power, witnesses, and an entire system that seemed stacked against her. Everyone thought she'd lost before she even began. But Rachel understood something that her mother never did. Real strength isn't about controlling others. It's about refusing to be controlled. Her mother paid $389,000 in penalties and restitution. She lost her lawyer, her reputation, her friends, and her family connections. But the real punishment wasn't financial. It was the loss of the one thing she valued most, her ability to manipulate and control the people around her. For someone who spent decades believing that power meant making others bend to her will, being stripped of that power was worse than any prison sentence. And Rachel, she didn't get revenge by destroying her mother. She got freedom by making sure her mother could never hurt her again. There's a difference, and it's an important one. Now, I want to talk about something deeper here, because I think Rachel's story teaches us a lesson that goes far beyond courtrooms and inheritance battles. How many of us have people in our lives who use love as a weapon, who twist family loyalty into obligation, who make us feel guilty for setting boundaries or protecting ourselves? Rachel's mother spent 20 years punishing her daughter for one act of independence, and she would have spent 20 more if Rachel hadn't stopped her. The truth is, not every relationship is worth saving. Not every family bond deserves to be maintained. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who treat your autonomy as a betrayal. Rachel lost her mother in that courtroom, but she'd already lost her years ago. What she gained was something far more valuable, the certainty that she would never again have to apologize for living her own life. For those of you watching who might be dealing with someone like Rachel's mother, someone who uses manipulation, guilt, or emotional blackmail to control you, please hear this. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to set boundaries. You are allowed to say no even to family, even to people who claim they're acting out of love. Real love doesn't demand that you sacrifice your dignity, your autonomy, or your peace of mind. Real love doesn't require you to stay small so someone else can feel big. Rachel's story also shows us the power of patience. She didn't react emotionally. She didn't fight back immediately. She waited, she observed, and she let her mother's own actions create the consequences. That's wisdom, and it's something we could all learn from. Sometimes the strongest move isn't the loudest one. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever had to stand up to a family member who tried to control your life? Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself? What would you have done in Rachel's situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because your experiences matter, and sharing them might help someone else who's going through something similar. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships or gave you courage to set boundaries in your own life, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We share real stories from real people every week, stories about resilience, justice, and people who refuse to stay victims. And if you know someone who needs to hear Rachel's story, someone who's struggling with a controlling family member or a toxic relationship, share this video with them. Sometimes knowing you're not alone makes all the difference. Leave us a comment telling us what you thought about Rachel's approach. Was she right to wait and let her mother self-destruct? Or would you have handled it differently? We read every single comment, and we love hearing your perspectives. Thank you for watching. And remember, freedom is always worth fighting for, even when the battle is against someone who's supposed to love you.